Since it's a feria today, there is no real collect for today other than last Sunday's. And we could default to yesterday, which is the Feast of Perpetua and Felicitas, which is a very worthy feast. But based on what we're going to do tonight, we're going to default to tomorrow for St. Gregory of Nyssa. But we'll wait till Michelle gets back and start that. Here comes Amelia.
There she is. You can't go on without me.
Hakurios meth humon. Diathomen. Almighty God, you have revealed to your church your eternal being of glorious majesty and perfect love as one God in Trinity of persons. Give us grace that, like your Bishop Gregory of Nyssa, we may continue steadfast in the confession of this faith and constant in our worship of you, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, for you live and reign forever and ever. Amen. Now that was the collect for the feast of St. Gregory of Nyssa, which is actually tomorrow. One of the reasons we are using it tonight is that tonight we're going to start something a little bit different. We are going to continue to focus on Lesson 11 and what we've just started to learn in the Perfect and Pluperfect. We're going to look at our assigned homework for the translation from the 5th chapter of John. But we're going to play with some more inductive learning that will take us. It's not totally fair because not every word in what we're going to work in is strictly Koine biblical Greek. It is early antique Greek, not classical Greek, but early Greek of the church, so it's very related to biblical Greek. But we're going to start a translation exercise of the Apostles' Creed. And there will be words that you will encounter that you'll just know from the Apostles' Creed. That's not what we're going to do. No matter how well you know the Creed, the temptation to just say, here's what the word means, I want you to resist. Because we're going to use this a little bit more as an inductive learning puzzle. When I pass this out, you will get the Apostles' Creed in Greek, and you will also get a 12 or 13-page document, which is an exposition of the Creed, a theological exposition of the Creed. It has a whole outline of it for both the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed, and sort of footnotes it and says, when we say these words, here's what it means theologically. But when we start that exposition, there's also a series of footnotes that basically tells you what the biblical origin is for each phrase or word in the Creed. So as we're struggling with what the translation is, we're supposed to now go back to those verses in the Bible and play with them. So what I want you to do, let's take an example here. If I take the first phrase from the Apostles' Creed, and say, pisteu un eis theon patera. We know that in English it means, I believe in God the Father. And we could look at the Greek and see, pisteu o, I believe. And we could figure out eis theon, accusative, and with the preposition, patera. We could figure that out. We'd have to struggle with un a little bit. Why does it literally, if we just did this word by word, say, I believe, therefore, in God, Father, the Father? But what I want us to do is, when we would translate that, we would literally label everything. So we start playing with what's going on grammatically, how that relates to the Bible verses, and what's happening theologically. So I'm going to pass those out now. And we're going to play with those later in the class. We're going to work first back in Lesson 11 and our translation exercise. Why would I say this isn't necessarily New Testament Greek? Right, this isn't in the New Testament. Our first sort of record of anything that starts to look like the Apostles' Creed is as early as the year 80 or 96, where we would see something that would generally be called the Old Roman symbol. The Apostles' Creed, as we've come to know it, is really more a product of the 3rd and 4th centuries. 4th century, really. And doesn't really get put into the form that we use it today until almost the 9th century. Now, the variations are not material, but the point is that the Apostles' Creed is, in terms of the development of theological expression, older than the Nicene Creed, but in terms of the final form we receive it in, younger than the Nicene Creed. We just prayed the collect for St. Gregory of Nyssa, who was very instrumental as one of the Cappadocian fathers with Basil of Caesarea in the First Council of Constantinople in the year 381. And the Nicene Creed, as we know it, subject to one other variation, is technically, if you want to be really theological about this, the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed, because it's from the Council of Nicaea, First Council in 325, and the First Council of Constantinople in 381. It doesn't get finished until 381. So Gregory was very important in that, and that's why we used his collect today rather than Perpetua and Felicitas, since we had to transfer forward or backward. As I say, we're going to get to this, but let me first walk you through what this handout will do. First, it will give you all of the Apostles' Creed in Greek. What you will find if you Google Apostles' Creed in Greek is you will find more than one variation out there. There will be an additional line there in some that you will find in use in modern churches. Don't worry about that for purposes of this exercise. On the next page after that, you'll see we start a document that just has the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed on page 1. If you flip that over on page 2, it says, for each one of the numbered footnotes on page 1, in the Apostles' Creed, where can we find biblical authority for this language? So if we take, for example, let's just take footnote 3, Creator of heaven and earth. You flip over and you see recitation or a set of citations to Genesis, to some Psalms, to Isaiah 40, to Romans 1, to Revelation 4. And each one of those verses or sections is kind of summed up in a phrase. Some of these connections are more direct than others, but you can go back there and play with these. Now, if you keep flipping through, you'll see that for each phrase of the creed, there is an outline that says theologically what's going on. And that the outline for the Nicene Creed basically is the same as for the Apostles' Creed, but there's some extra stuff in there because the Nicene Creed is much longer than the Apostles' Creed. The reason being, the Apostles' Creed makes a basic statement of faith. Then there are arguments back and forth as to what some of these statements mean. The Nicene Creed amplifies to say what they don't mean as well as what they mean. So if you go through all of those phrases, you get to the end and you say, here's where these things come from and what they say. Now, that's not what we're going to be doing for translation purposes. For translation purposes, again, not all of this is biblical Greek. So there are going to be some things we run into. But again, if we go back to the first phrase in the creed here, we would say pisteuo, and we'd recognize that as primary or present active indicative, first person, and we'd say, I believe. But what I really want you to do in this translation exercise is, whether you write above or below, write above, I believe, and below write present, active, indicative, first person, some kind of abbreviation. Un, therefore, and write what that is, what part of speech. Eis, huh? Un is therefore. And so, it's an adverb, yeah. Then eis is a preposition in. Theon is God in the accusative. Patera is father, and what part of speech is that? It's a proper noun. Now, go back for a second and look at the English translation. I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. Do you see any of those words in here? No, just in the first line here. God the Father Almighty, right? Right. And so taking the name God Father, you're going to see how we get into translation arguments over this, right? What I don't want you to do is just sit there and say, well, I know the Apostles' Creed, so I know what this says. I want you to actually work this and play with it and go back and look at the Bible verses and say, what's happening with these words grammatically? Now, that was not the best example. But as we go through here, we're going to encounter a couple grammatical forms you haven't learned yet. That's okay. Circle it. Try to figure out what it is. If you can't figure it out, put a big question mark, and then we'll talk about that. This is more a little bit of a code-breaking exercise to sit there and say, based on what we know, what can we fill in, and what gaps are remaining there. So this is going to take you some time, and you don't need to worry about it tonight. We're not going to do this in class. This is your homework for the next 2 weeks, is to really sort of play with the creed and work with this as a translation exercise pointing you to theology. Fair enough? Now, the translation exercise that we had as homework for tonight is in 1 John, and I'll pass those out. You've probably transcribed it yourself, but we'll pass out the printed version. Yes.
Does that have any bearing on Flotilla?
No. Total false cognate there. Tulip, tulip as a theological position is an acronym derived in English. So it's just a mnemonic for, how Reformed theology fits together there. We could say we're in the military and have a whole bunch of acronyms, right? JACWA, Joint Allied Command, Western Approaches, right? This is stuff you have to rattle off. STANDNAV for land, right? You were in the Air Force. You should know these things. You were D/W, okay. Don't mess with her. I still think when you were made archdeacon, we should have gotten you a nameplate that rather than saying Staff Sergeant Whitford said Chief Master Sergeant or something like that. Just really don't mess with her. All right. Let's go back and do a little deductive review in Lesson 11. No, just on page 48 here in the book. A little deductive review, talking about how things work and what they are. Get your cheat sheet out. That's fair enough. Everybody still working vocabulary cards? You're going to find that really helps you in this because you'll start recognizing stems when you get an irregular and it's messing with you, or a second aorist is messing with you, or something like that. So, the perfect and the pluperfect. And what do we have? We have action begun in the past with lingering results in the present, the perfect. And we talked about that last time using what example? No, what theological example? It was on the handout. Right, tetelestai in John 9:32. And the fact that that's perfect rather than an aorist leads to a very specific theological insight. Then we get the pluperfect, lingering results which have ceased prior to the present. And what's our sort of like default translation, fill in the blank on something like that? What would the perfect be? For luo. Have. I have loosed. What would the pluperfect be in English? I had loosed, right? And we can think about whether we're drawing a dot and a line coming from it or a line going up to a dot, right? Both of these are a combination of punctiliar and linear action. Depends on which direction they're going, the line that is. When we talk about the aorist, we're talking about punctiliar action, right? When we're talking about the imperfect, we're talking about linear action. So, again, if it's useful to think about where's the dot and where's the line, or whether there's a dot or a line, just start visualizing things in terms of the kind of action being described. Now, again, notice that we're in the perfect active indicative in this chapter. So we're going to talk about perfect as actions begun in the past with lingering results in the present. But let's review those other terms in there. What do we mean by active? What type of characteristic of a verb are we using there? It's the voice. And we have in English active and passive voice, correct? And in Greek we have active and passive and middle. Now, let's think about that in English, using just an example of the perfect. And let's come up with a verb that will illustrate this. If I take the verb to write, grapho, but let's do it in English here. In the perfect, I would say, I have written. The aorist would be something like, I wrote, right? But we could perhaps make an argument. No, well, we'd make the pluperfect, I had written. So if I take I write, we would say the aorist would be I wrote, if we had an aorist in English, rather than a simple past tense. A perfect, in the Greek sense, would be I have written, and a pluperfect in the Greek sense would be I had written. Those would all be in active voice. What would passive voice be in English? It was written. It has been written. It had been written. Well, again, we're blending English and Greek here. What I'm trying to say is for the voice, rather than I have written, it was written, we could argue maybe, or it has been written. That sounds quite biblical. It has been written, you know. Yeah, forget English grammar here. I'm just using it as an illustration of how the Greek works. In English, we're not going to use the same terminology for some of these tenses, okay? A passive voice for, let's put it present tense. I write. Passive. It is written. What would a middle be? We don't have that in English, right? So the closest we would get in English would be to use some auxiliary verbs around it and say, let it be written, or that it may be written, which is sometimes where you see things in Greek that look like a middle and a passive together. There's some blending there. So when we say perfect here, we're talking about the action begun in the past with lingering results in the present, in the active voice. At some point, we're going to learn the middle and the passive. Then it says indicative. What part or characteristic of a verb is indicative, indicating? It's mood, right. And the mood here is one of reality. The indicative mood says, this is real. What other moods are there? Subjunctive. And so in English, if we were going to say something in the subjunctive, we'd say that it might be written, that it should be written. There's a conditional there to it, right? That we want it to happen, but it hasn't happened. Greek, we also get a mood called optative. It's very rare in the Bible, but optative in English, we'd have to really be poetic. Oh, that it might be written. We get, so if we just take perfect as the tense, active as the voice, and indicative as the mood, that's what we're working in Lesson 11, plus the pluperfect. What we are encountering, and this is where our inductive learning is sort of meshing a little bit with our deductive learning, what we're encountering in our translation exercises in 1 John is a lot of changes in voice, right? We keep running across perfect passive, perfect middle passive. We see changes in mood. We keep getting some subjunctives in there. We haven't sat down yet and said, here's what letter changes to signal a subjunctive. Here's what letter changes to signal a passive voice. We've called those out, but those haven't been part of our lessons yet. When we get to those in our lessons, you'll start saying, oh, this was back in 1 John 4, right? So how are we going to recognize a first perfect active indicative? Well, there will be some reduplication before the stem. We'll get a kappa after the stem. And then we'll get something that pretty much looks like the secondary active endings with some variations. And we see the examples here. So if we go back to luo, we get lelu plus the kappa. And then we're just going to start sticking on a secondary active ending, except there is none for two of these endings. And C is going to be different. So again, looking at the paradigm for luo, we get leluka, lelukas, leluke, lelukamen, lelukate, lelukasi. And then, of course, there's going to be a second perfect, which is going to mess us up. Not quite as much as the second aorist, but here's where the table in the back on, what is it, page 128, is going to be your friend. Because any of the verbs we are going to encounter in the book are going to be in that table if they do something weird. Now, if we encounter them in 1 John or somewhere else, they might not be there. So we might, have to circle something and say, what is this? But again, we see I have loosed, you have loosed. And same with grapho, I have written, you have written. Again, those are all active voice, right? What are we looking for? Reduplication or lengthened vowel, plus the stem, plus the alpha and the secondary active endings for the secondary. We don't get a kappa in the second perfect, right? So if we're thinking reduplication and kappa, first perfect. Reduplication, no kappa, second perfect. Second perfect might be a lengthened vowel instead of reduplication. This is something that you're just going to have to do. And we're going to keep doing it and, start recognizing it. Our default, which is grossly oversimplified, is to translate I have blanked, you have blanked, he, she, it has blanked, etc. Pluperfect, past completed event with lingering effects, but the effects are over. So I had loosed. And here it's going to be very similar. There'll be an augment, perhaps reduplication, a kappa, but here there's going to be a coupling vowel, and it's not going to be an alpha, it's going to be the diphthong, epsilon iota. And then we're going to do the same kind of secondary active endings. So if we say kappa epsilon iota, our first reaction is going to be, oh, this is a first pluperfect. If you're making a cheat sheet chart, if you see a KEI, you're going to go, ooh, probably a first pluperfect. Here we see luo, eleleukain, eleleukes, eleleukai. And we see pisteuo as an example as well, where there's reduplication, pepisteukain. Pepisteuokais. We've actually encountered that in one of our translations. We get the recognition rules on 52, and we see the second pluperfect, no kappa. But we still have the epsilon iota as a coupling diphthong. We have some examples here for eleleuthein, I had come. Now, what's the underlying verb for that? Eleleuthein. What would be the verb for I come? Erkomai. So see how this one's going to just kind of throw us sideways. This is where playing with vocabulary and working with this, we're just going to come to know some of these. So the same way as we get things that are totally different in English between went and gone or something like that, we will start recognizing those. And at the bottom of 52, you also see perfect active infinitives. We add enai to the perfect stem. Now, what's enai by itself? To be. There's a little review on what's happening with hoti on page 53 here. And these are rules we've already applied, so I'll leave those to you for review. Does anybody remember what my homework was? I was to look at the TDNT and find out what some of these usages are, right? And the first one is aletheia. Now, we're to look up the first and second early Christian uses of this word. Well, I'm going to tell you in a minute, but why would we restrict ourselves to looking in the TDNT to the early Christian uses? Because this is an existing Greek word, and we'd have to look at all the background in Greek, in classical Greek, in Septuagint Greek, in the Greek version of the Old Testament. By the time we get to writing the New Testament, is there any evolution in the meaning of this word? Answer, yes. The first meaning is very simple. Truth is in contrast to lying or deception. So it corresponds to reality, and I'm telling you the truth. and we can distinguish truth from a lie or deception. But the second meaning, which is very closely related, is much more important, is that aletheia corresponds to ultimate reality. So when Jesus is talking about the truth will set you free, I am the way, the truth, and the life, he's taking a sort of an eschatological approach here to say, if you get all of the fallenness of the world out of the way and look at creation as created in God's will, then you get to the ultimate reality. And behind all of this ultimate reality is, or behind this false reality is the ultimate reality, which is ultimately true. This is going to become very important in Johannine usage in Revelation. So remember, the Greek word for revelation, apocalypsis, means revelation, but it means pull the curtain aside and see what's really behind there. And so aletheia is going to relate very much to that we are pointing towards ultimate reality. Now, Deacon's being clever here, because the second word he has us look up is semeion, which you will find is, in earlier Greek, used much more to just mean miracle. I'm on page 54, at the top of the homework. Now, we know that in the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, they talk about the miracles of Jesus. When John uses the word semeion, semeia is the plural, he is speaking of this much more in terms of sign or signal, not strictly miracle, but a sign of eschatological triumph. Now, let's unpack that. What's eschatology? Yeah, the theology of the end time, of the final judgment, right? Again, sort of an ultimate reality issue. So a miracle, a sign in John's usage, is not an upending of the natural order, but a signal of something fundamentally new within the natural order. So in other words, again, a miracle in John's usage, a sign, a semeion in John's usage is you've pulled that curtain aside a little bit and seen the real reality behind it. And so if we take probably the ultimate example, and certainly the last one in John's Gospel and the sort of culmination of the book of signs, the raising of Lazarus, what is that a sign of in ultimate reality? That God's will for us is everlasting life. If we go to the first miracle, the first sign, which is what?
Everybody drink wine.
Everybody drink wine. Where there's plenty of wine. God's ultimate reality is one of abundance and blessing. If Jesus says in another one of his signs, in the feeding of the 5,000, I am the bread of life, what is that sign pointing to as an ultimate reality? That all the sustenance we need in this life eternal comes from God. When he says, I am the good shepherd, my sheep know my voice, what is that pointing to? You know? So John's usage of semeia is very much sign. Now, let's be careful. What's the difference between a sign and a symbol? A symbol represents something else, and it can be arbitrary, right? We could sit there and say that a symbol of the United States is an eagle. Fair enough? Does this mean that the United States is in any sense of reality a large form of hawk that soars and eats carrion and fish? Well, you'd get an argument in some political circles, right? So a symbol stands for something else. It's an arbitrary symbol that is adopted in common usage. We have to agree on what a symbol is. What was the other bird that was proposed as a symbol of the United States besides the bald eagle? A turkey, right? We could have been a wild turkey. And then we'd all be Sergeant York going around going, right? A sign, however, points to the reality it participates in. It signifies the reality that is being revealed. So what is the ultimate sign in Christian belief? The cross, right? And so if we look behind me up here and we see Jesus on the cross, the reality that is being revealed to us, the ultimate reality that is being revealed to us, is that God is present to us, that God reaches out to us, that the consequence of our sin, the crucifixion of Jesus, is part of God's plan for our salvation. In our readings for this coming Sunday, we have an Old Testament lesson from Numbers, chapter 20 or 24, I think it's 24, where we have the bronze serpent, the brazen serpent, right? And what happens in that? The people are murmuring in the wilderness, right? This is, it's right at the same point that they've gotten manna, they've gotten water, they've gotten quails, there's been a rebellion. Moses' sister has just died, and they come to Moses and start, kvetching again. And they're like, their words don't make a lot of sense, because they say, you've brought us out here into the wilderness and there's no food, and we can't stand this food. It's kind of like when your teenager says there's nothing to eat in this house, because there's nothing that they can just, take the top off of. They'd have to cook or something, right? Some of us still think that way. The Lord sends fiery serpents into their midst. Our NRSV says poisonous, which is not inaccurate, but the original word means when they bite you, it burns. It's the same root for seraphim, burning beings, fiery being. And then they pray, oops, take away the fiery serpents. And Moses prays. And the word in Hebrew for it says that Moses prayed for them is a word that means they're praying together. They're praying through Moses. He's not praying over the people, for the people, but he and the people are in this together. And they pray to God, and what does God do? Does he take away the poisonous snakes? No, he says, make a big fiery serpent and raise it up before the people. And when they look on it, then when they're bitten, they'll be saved. That's what happens. And Jesus then, in our gospel lesson this Sunday, is going to say, just as Moses lifted up the bronze serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, and when they look on him, etc. So we're pointing to that sign. But notice that both the brazen serpent and the cross, does God take away the snakes? He doesn't take the snakes away. He has the people look upon the result of their sin in order to be saved. If we look on Jesus on the cross, we look on the result of our sin and say, my fingerprints are on the hammer and the nails. And now God in this sign is revealing his nature, plan, and purpose, which is exactly what Jesus does in the next verse when he gives us the most famous verse in all of Scripture. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believed in him should not perish, right? So sign becomes very important here in Johannine usage. And that's what we're seeing in Semeion in the TDNT. And, you could find whole books on this. You can find doctoral dissertations this long on the use of Semeion. So that's my homework.
Is that word used also in the Synoptics?
No.
Oh, it's a different word.
No, the word used in the Synoptics means more wonder, something that is like an aberration in nature. And I'm trying to remember the word right now. Well, let's find it. Let's pick a miracle in Mark. Okay, let's take the blind man, right? Man with the unclean spirit. Let's go with Bartimaeus, blind Bartimaeus. Let's see, that's in chapter 9, isn't he in 9? No, that's the unclean. Here we are. I'm sorry. It's in chapter 10. All right. Now, Bartimaeus hears that Jesus is coming by. And at verse 47, what does he do? It says, Kai akusas hoti Jesus ho Nazarenos estin I can't pronounce that because I can't do X sounds. Somebody pronounce that word. Irksato. Okay, I have a speech impediment on that. I took speech therapy for 10 years as a child, okay? S's and X's. Kratzein kai legain uye David Yesu. Or huye, yeah. Where's the breathing mark? There it is. Huye David Yesu. Eleison me. Son of David, Jesus, save me. Kyrie eleison, right? Verse 48. And it says that the crowd tells him to shut up. And in 49, it says that Jesus turns to him, Ho Jesus aipen, phonisate auton, kai phonusinton tuflon legontes auto, tharse. He wants to see, right? Verse 52, Kai ho Jesus aipen auto, hupate he pistis su sesoken se. Get up and go, your faith has made you well. Kai uthus, and immediately, there's Mark's favorite word, Kai uthus, aneblepsein. Aneblepsein. What's that coming from? Blepo. Immediately he saw Kai ikoluthe auto ente hodo. And he proceeded in the way. Now, Mark doesn't use a word here. Mark just describes what happens. Matthew and Luke generally follow Mark. We'd have to find a specific Matthean or Lucan example where they use the word. But Mark where he says he could do miracles? Oh, good example. It's described as a work of power. What is the word? A work of, he could do no mighty work there. No, what's the word for work again? No ergon dunatai. He doesn't use the word. Again, it's a descriptive phrase.
On page 145, the demand for a sign.
Okay.
Use on that, so it would be 8:11 through 13.
Let's find it. The Pharisees say to him, yes, they say Simeon, Zetuntes gar autu Simeon apotu uranu. What sign can you from heaven show us? What sign of heaven is what they say here? Actually, let's look at this in an interlinear. What do we have? That's Mark 8:11. Okay. Kai exelthon hoi pharisiai oi, kai ertanto synsetain auto zetuntes par autu semeion, a sign. Same word. My point is that when Mark or Matthew or Luke describe a miracle, they don't use the word sign. John does that.
So what does that say about John and the Pharisees who are asking for the same thing? Like the Pharisees are asking for this, and Jesus doesn't give them, yet in John, that's all he's giving. What does that kind of say?
Okay, let's look at what's happening at two levels here. One, John's theology is that, first of all, in Mark, for example, Jesus' disciples are clueless. Nobody really knows who he is. And there is no real identification of Jesus until he's on the cross. And then who identifies him? The Roman soldier who's the head of the execution party. Who are the only people before that in Mark's gospel who say who Jesus is? Demons, outsiders, right? There's always that Markan secret going on. Matthew and Luke are less extreme on that. John's totally different. His disciples kind of get it, right? They follow him around. They see who he is. Even in Mark, when it says that he stills the storm on the Sea of Galilee, they're saying, who is this? Who's still, the wind and the sea obey, but they still are kind of like not connecting the dots. They're on the short bus, okay? And so when John is saying this is a sign, when he says, for example, in the changing of the water into wine at the wedding of Cana, this was the first of his signs. He's setting up right away. This is pointing to who Jesus is. Then with most of these signs throughout John, there's a miracle that's accompanied, and that's described as the sign. So it'll be water to wine, or it'll be the raising of Lazarus, or it will be something else of that sort, some casting out of a demon. Now, we could just say that John has a different view here and a different experience. We could also sit there and say, if Mark's written about the year 64, 65, 66, based on Peter's recollections, and John's not written till about the year 95, that now you have another 3 decades of people talking about their experience of Jesus and handing that on. The way Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 15, this has been handed on to me. So you could say there's a development of doctrine going on by the time John starts to write.
Would you also say that there's a development of the audience and what their expectations are when they're reading about this Jesus, as opposed to the first reading and what they think versus what their expectations may be from the author? And that, as an author, he's writing to those expectations as much as he's using this language.
There's a technical term for your argument, and I can't remember it, but it basically says in reader reception theory that a development of doctrine is a push-pull process, where doctrine develops in response in part to who the audience are and what's happening around them. If we're saying, for example, that by the time John is writing his gospel is the first time we're starting to see empire-wide persecution, which is true because we get the first real empire-wide persecution in 96. When Mark and Peter are killed in 64 or 67, that's limited only to the city of Rome. Then we start seeing that John's more eschatological focus, that the curtain's being pulled aside, starts making sense because throughout the history of the Bible, the literary genre of apocalypse shows up in the midst of persecution. And it's kind of like sitting there and saying, everything's going bad around you, but this isn't the ultimate reality. Stay faithful and the ultimate reality will be revealed to you. And you will experience the ultimate reality and be saved that way. This is a temporary trial.
Is there another theological term for the idea that maybe because John is really writing this at the end of his life, And so his writing will kind of highlight that psychological experience that he's going through.
You know, if you look at something somebody writes when they're 80 versus when they're 30, they're going to be pretty different, right? I mean, we're a little bit more reflective, I hope, as we get older. Well, if he's on drugs and that results in revelation, I want some of those drugs. There, that's out on the internet. People always misquote Karl Marx on that. It's not a negative statement he's making. Not that I'm a fan of Karl Marx, just for the record. Yeah, there is probably a development of doctrine going on here between the mark and just description of what happens. And when the word sign shows up, it's something that somebody else is saying, like, do a mighty work for us here, show us a miracle. In fact, I would argue, and I'll bet there's a dissertation on this somewhere, that the Johannine usage of semeion, more to be sign, is a transition phase here, and that the Markan use is probably a little bit more miracle than sign. So, again, when we talk about development of doctrine, this is the point that David Bentley Hart makes in his translation of the New Testament. He says, we have to look not only at how we translate a word, but do we translate the word because of our doctrinal position on what the word means, because it's always been translated that way, and that's the way we understand that word. I think you could make a case that when Mark or Peter is using the word semeion here, they're thinking of it more in terms of miracle than as sign pointing to something, pointing to ultimate reality. Right, but the way Mark would record this is my point. So, the Pharisees, though, what are they saying? What sign from heaven? So from a Pharisaic perspective, what would a sign from heaven be? Something that is the ultimate reality. We kind of end up at the same place, but it's almost like we're dealing with active and middle voices here in terms of what semeion's doing. And, of course, we don't get active and middle voices for a noun. I'm making a very rough analogy. Fair enough? We have not even looked at the creed yet, and we're playing a lot with theology. So it's 8 o'clock, and we'll take a brief pause. I haven't been there. I don't know. Well, location is... She's talking about the location of Harvest Cafe. Now, if you turn to page 54, we have already done the homework in here, right? So that is going to take us to our translation exercise, 1 John chapter 5, verses 1 through 5. While we're talking about homework, as you're working on the Apostles' Creed, your homework for the first week includes, I expect you next week to come in here with a reason, your own reason, for why in the first line of the Apostles' Creed that we translate as, I believe in God the Father, we see literally in the Greek, I believe therefore in God the Father. What's that word therefore doing there? What's the function of the word? What's happening theologically? And whatever answer you formulate for that, why is it not included in the translation? Including into the Latin that was used for centuries in the West. Well, normally, yes. Therefore is a post-positive. It has to refer to something previous. But what is that word doing there theologically, and why do we not translate it generally? So that's your first assignment from a theology perspective. And come up with your argument. See if grammar has anything to do with theology here. Now, let's take a look at 1 John chapter 5, beginning at verse 1. And we just will start out. Pas ho pisteuon hoti Jesus estin ho Christus. Pas. Everyone ho pisteuon. Everyone believing. Now, we encounter participles a lot. Let's just do a timeout. Start speaking in English. What is the function of a participle in English? Well, it's basically an adjective that functions as a verb and a verb that functions as an adjective, right? And so if I were to take an example and say, Carl stands before the screen, present active indicative, right, of a verb. I stand before the screen. That would also be a present active indicative where I would say in the active voice what I'm doing here. I stand before the screen. If I said, standing before the screen, I speak to you, and go on from there. Standing is doing two things. It is a descriptor, and so it has an adjectival function for, my state of being, that I'm here. I'm sorry? But standing itself is a participle, because it is both a descriptor and implying or basically describing what the action is. Might not be the best example, but that's what's going to happen in Greek as well. A participle is going to be the same thing. It is something that is taking a verb and an adjective and mushing them together. And you'll note that in most cases when we encounter a participle, at least in Johannine usage, it's going to refer basically almost to a state of being. So here we have in the first phrase, everyone believing. It's not just everyone. It's not just the believing one. It's everyone believing. This is a distinct state of being for the persons described, correct? The hall is just the definite article that stands in with everyone to point that it connects the everyone and the believing. I'm sorry? It can be either. It's sort of a contextual thing. Now, if you said all believing, would we know what you're talking about? Yeah, we'd say you're referring to people because people are the things that believe. We wouldn't say she's talking about tables that believe, you know. So everyone believing or all believing, hoti, that Jesus estin ho Christos, Jesus is the Christ, ek tu theo, of God, gegenitai, has been born. Yes, this is a perfect, but it is a middle passive voice. Has been born. Now, just circle the ending there, tai. When you start seeing that showing up with the tau, say, ooh, is this a change in voice? We haven't learned that deductively yet. But we've seen this enough that we should start saying, is something happening here signaling a change in voice? Kai pas ho agapon, and everyone loving, ton genisanta. Yeah, this is kind of confusing. This is an aorist participle active. Aorist participle active. Okay, so, and everyone loving the one, ton, having begotten him, going back to the everyone, so him or her, the person, and everyone loving the one, having begotten him, agapa, loves, present active indicative, third person singular, kai ton gegenimenon, well, you're actually just signaling a voice change again here. This is a perfect participle middle passive voice. Having been begotten.
So I'm a bit confused about the begotten before and begotten in this. Who is begotten in the first one? Are they talking about like God who does the begetting?
No, the one who believes.
So if I believe, I'm
Begotten of God.
okay.
And that's what he's saying in the next phrase, ex autou. The one having been begotten from him. Let's see what the RSV does with that. And so we say in RSV English, they don't make it a participle, they make it an active verb. Everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ is a child of God, has been begotten. And everyone who loves the parent loves the child. Now, what are they doing with parent here? They're saying, and everyone we see in the Greek loving the one having begotten him. So that's the parent. of Christ loves the one having begotten him. So it's
Is that a fair translation? Because you're taking, and I know it's confusing to think of it this way, but it's almost just say the child and the parent. Are we losing something theologically when we change the words like that in our
everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ is a child of God, and everyone who loves the parent loves the child. So let's play with that.
It's not a true translation.
Because it's not a true translation at all, but what they're asking us to connect is child and parent. Having named the child and named the child, or the parent, will make that connection the way it's done in the Greek. Let's see what they actually do with an interlinear on that. Okay, everyone believing that Jesus is the Christ of God has been born. So, begotten, born, we're pretty close. And everyone loving the one having begotten him, referring back to who? Having begotten who? Loves also the one having been begotten from him. RSV takes a lot of liberties here, right? Everyone believing that Jesus is the Christ of God has been born, and everyone loving of God has been born, and everyone loving the one having begotten him loves also the one having been begotten from him. So child and God, child and Father are being equated here between Jesus and the Father. RSV makes it look more like an equation between the child of God and the Father. Now, is that because of the voice?
Sounds kind of Gnostic to me.
Is it because of the voice? This little light of mine, I'm gonna, what?
It always turns into a song and dance.
I didn't even have a Negroni. She had a Negroni before class. I'd really be singing if I'd had a Negroni, but. So I agree with you. There's some liberties being taken here. Let's move on to verse 2. En tuto ginoskomen hoti agapomen ta teknatu theu. Yeah, this, we've got a dative, right? En, so the en becomes a by. By this, ginoskomen, we know that one. That's pretty straightforward. We know. Hoti, that we love. But why is it not agapamen? It is. We should love the children of God.
Why would they call them technically children of God rather than the begotten of God, as they mentioned in the sentence before?
I think
It's kind of funny how they switch, because we were just talking about the translation, how we are children, but we are born of, or we are begotten of God. I wonder why God doesn't stick with it.
The word begotten is reserved.
Or maybe he's just right.
Because look at it's the genitive in both of those. Having begotten, have been born, has been born. So we are the has been born,
Sometimes it feels like that.
Jesus is the only one that's ever described as the only begotten one.
Right, as the only begotten of the Father. There might be a very prosaic explanation. And the explanation might be John sitting there and saying, I've used that word twice, let me come up with a different usage. You know, it might be just that doing it 3 times in a row, you want... It could be just that he's done it twice in one sentence, and so now we'll call them children of God rather than those begotten of God, right? Does it mean the same thing? Yeah. Now, notice he's not saying only begotten, right? Yes, because only begotten would be monogenes, right?
But he doesn't say that up there in verse 1.
He doesn't, no.
Which is interesting that we are as begotten as Jesus. But we're not the mono-begotten.
This is, again, if we start taking individual verses of the Bible. Because in the first chapter of John's Gospel, the Son is begotten of the Father. And then in the 3rd chapter, he's referred to as the only begotten, which incidentally our NRSV translation for the lectionary, we noticed this today in Bible study, translates as only. God's only Son. It doesn't say God's only begotten Son. It just says God's only Son. Why? I don't know. Because it's not an accurate translation. But NRSV, yeah. So, ta tekna tu theu, the children of God. Hotan ton theon agapomen kai tas entolas autou poi omen. What's hotan? When? Ton theon. What's the case? Accusative. When God, agapomen, we might love. Might, should, but might works better here. When we might love God, kai tas entolas, and the commandments of him we should keep.
So, which we should love and we should keep.
Yeah, I'd say might works better as a state of being more. Again, let's take a look at what RSV does. By this, we know that we love the children of God when they've put that in that way, when we love God and obey his commandments. So they've made poiomen obey rather than keep. Fair enough. No? What is actually poieo? To be able. Right, to be able to do. So keep or obey is a fair translation. Verse 3. Haute. Notice it's not aute, it's haute. Does that change it?
Not the pronoun.
What's your translation? And what would the pronoun be? Anybody else want to jump in? But it's haute. It's not she. It's this. Haute gar. You got to pay attention to breathing marks. And we noticed that as well on some other things like ain and hain, right? So, haute gar estin.
Is.
Yeah, what's the gar in there? Yeah, indeed. You know, I mean, we could switch the order and say, for this is, but it would be more accurate to say, this indeed is, he agape tu theou, the love of God. Hina tas entolas autu tiromen. Tiromen. So what did you come up with?
I found the verb that was high, eta, row.
I translated this as we should keep, but I got to go back and find. Tereo, yeah, okay. Okay, tereo, okay, yeah. Trying to remember the stem. Oh, I'm sorry. No, I'm looking at poiomen. What do I have here? Oh, it's the next verse. Okay, right. All right, you're confusing me now.
Verse 3.
All right. And that's coming from tereo, yes. Tereo. Oh. Okay, let's make a theological argument about that. Rather than poiomen, we're saying tiromen here. And poiomen says we are able to do this, and so we keep them or obey them. If the original meaning of the underlying verb tereo is guard, observe, keep, perhaps John, as a good Jew, is sitting there and thinking to what? What does Jeremiah say about the commandments of the Lord? That those who truly believe will do what? They will write them on their hearts and guard them. Yeah, this is owning it. This is owning it. This might be a Jeremiah echo, or at least a prophetic echo, that we are guarding the commandments of God because they've become a part of us. They're written on our hearts, and we are just enveloping them. Now, that's just an argument I'm making. You know, you could say, I'm sorry, that doesn't make any sense. But, again, you could come up with a simple explanation. We could make this a linguistic Occam's razor and say he wants to change words. But if the original meaning is guard in terms of keeping or observing, there might be something going on theologically there that's an echo of prophetic literature. Because John certainly kind of likes prophetic literature, not quite as much as Matthew in terms of how he cites it. But that might be what's going on. You could have fun with that at any rate. I mean, if you made that argument on a paper, you'd get points, okay? I'd say it was a good argument. Because I just made it, hey, so. Yeah. Mm-hmm. You're saying you don't like people sucking up to you? As if, no. Okay. Where are we? Kai, hai entolai autu barayai uk aisin.
It's the third person plural.
It's the third person plural. So why is it entolai when it was just entolos in the prior? No, it's still plural. But why is it different? It's the case, right? In that the commandments of him, entolos, is accusative. And here we have, and the commandments of him, it's nominative. So it's a nominative case, and the commandments of him, it is feminine. And it is third declension. Barai uk isin. What's barai? Burdensome. Yeah, burdensome. And notice the ending is agreeing in the nominative here with entolai. Uk isin, not ar. Yeah, and the commandments of him, burdensome, not are. Hoti.
So,
Yeah, for would probably work here as opposed positive. Hoti, pan, nominative here. This is all. For all to gegenimenon ektu theu. Yes, for all having been born. Middle passive voice, perfect participle. Ektu theu, of God. Nika ton kosmon. Conquer, overcomes. How many of you have ever seen an altar frontal that has this on it? What's that stand for?
Jesus Christ.
Jesus Christus, Nika. I think I've got this backwards, but it basically is Jesus Christ conquers. You see that around the cross on an altar frontal. This is wrong. Scratch that out. I've got to go back and figure that one out. But it's Jesus Christ conquers. Nika. Now, what is the nominative noun for that? Nike, right. What do we do with that in English? Nike. This means victory. How is this connected with running shoes originally? Well, Goddess of Victory is certainly called Nike, but when the Battle of Marathon has been won, and Pheidippides runs the 26 miles from Marathon to Athens and collapses in the Agora, the Athenian equivalent of the Forum, his word in coming in and collapsing is Nike, victory. And so, why not make running shoes for that? What other running shoe has a classical allusion? No, that's not. That's just the guy's name, Adi Dassler. Asics. Anima sana in corpore sano. A healthy mind and a healthy body. It's a Latin saying. So, Adidas is an abbreviation of the man's name, but in high school we all said it meant. You're not on mic. Oh, you're right. All day I dream about it. Right, but it's really Adi Dassler.
I could go to bed and learn something new.
That's off mic too. Where are we here in verse 4? We're translating the holy word of God, and you are being in the gutter here. I mean, you're going to have to go to confession now. Yeah.
That's right.
Kai.
Overcomes the
Kai haute estin he nike, he nike sasa ton cosmon. It's an aorist participle active.
Oh, that's so lovely.
And it is a nominative feminine singular, so it's going back to Nike. So it's, and this is the victory, having overcome the world. He pistis himon. The faith of us. Let's kind of English this, okay? For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. For whatever is born of God overcomes the world. And this is the victory that overcomes the world, our faith. Now, notice they make it whatever, not whoever. Why do they do that? They've basically taken for all, having been born of God, overcome the world, and made it into for whatever has been born of God, overcomes the world. Does that change that at all? Makes it less personal, right? I mean, it's supposed to be written in our hearts and change us. Shouldn't it be us and not whatever? Verse 5. Tis. No, notice the accent. There's an accent here, not. If it was no accent, it would be an article. With an accent, it's who. De esin. Who now is ho Nikon, participial form here. Who is the one overcoming? Ton cosmon. I, me, ho pisteuon. If not the one believing, hoti Jesu estin, ho huios tu theu. If not the one believing that Jesus is the Son of God. And the RSV renders that as, who is it that overcomes the world but he who believes that Jesus is the Son of God? They don't say if not in the translation. Now, wait a minute. You're saying at the end of verse 4, what's happened? Oh, you're saying whatever in the RSV? No, in the Greek it says whoever, and in the RSV it's made it whatever. I don't think in 1950 they were too concerned about AIs, but, and that, of course, presupposes an ontological dimension to an AI, a whole separate topic, right? Now, we've played with this a lot. But what have we done? We've almost made it through a whole book of the Bible, right? So we're going to go away from 1 John for a week. And you're going to play in the Creed. But again, let's talk about what you're going to do in the Creed. Wipe your minds clean from being able to recite the Apostles' Creed. Right? I know what I did wrong with this. Sorry. Yeah, I see. Jesus Christus. No, it is. Because it's for the capital new. Jesus Christ conquers. Conquer the cookie, right. Overcome the St. Patrick cookie.
I-N-H-S?
No, that's a different saying. You're thinking of IHS, Impulsinio, that's Latin.
Mr. Bernie says in here, stupid.
There you go. All of the pages that are attached here about the creed, I mean, you can agree with or disagree with. That's not the point. The point is to refer you back to what's happening in biblical literature, because these will be background texts for the people who are actually sitting down and writing the creed. And so when they're picking words, and we say, for example, that we say, I believe, and there's a footnote there. And footnote 1 says, examples of faith in Matthew, classic passage on what faith is with examples in Hebrews. Faith without action is empty in John. So when somebody says, I believe, their understanding of what it means to be believed, what it means to believe, is going to be encompassed in those words, right? Now, this isn't the best example for what we're trying to do in translation, because we know a simple present active indicative here, pisteuo, I believe. But as you're going through here, try to get out of your mind how you have learned to say this creed, and think about what's actually happening here in the original language. And when I go to translate it, let me just label it grammatically too. What is this? Again, I've given you that first assignment to say the un in here, the postpositive, the therefore, which we don't see in translation. What's it there for? And what statement is that making theologically that it's present? Then we see pantokratora. Now, let's just play with that for a minute. We know what pan means, right, as a root. We've just encountered it. All, right? What's the word autocrat mean? Colloquially now, technically an autocrat is someone who has self-rule, not subject to anybody else's rule, right? So a pantocrat is one who rules all. Now, if you were to get out your... Right, that's what that word is. If you were to get your lexicon out for biblical Greek here, do we see pantokrator in there? Well, get your dictionary. Yeah. It does have pantokrator, or pantokratos, yes, the Almighty of God. Notice how they've translated all ruler into Almighty. They've made might to be the form of rule. Potestas in Latin. Majestas and potestas in Latin are combined into rule, right? Majesty and power. So I can have power, but if I don't have the right majesty, it's not legitimate power. Poietein uranu kai geis. Poieo, it means what? To be able. So if we're saying poietein is embodying the ableness here. Uranu kai geis. heaven and earth. Now, again, all I want you to do in playing with these, some of these words you're just going to be able to figure out. Some you're going to get stumped at because the vocabulary is obscure to you or the form is. I want you to think theologically in the translation and label each word for what it is and what its case is and what its voice is and things like that for what you can figure out. And then start saying, what's actually happening here as a statement of belief?
One who does or carries out.
Again, we're not going to do this right now. Now, just going on, we say, Kai es Jesun Christon, accusative, and in Jesus Christ, huion autou ton monogene, the Son of Him only begotten, ton kurion himon, the Lord of us, right? Again, think of what's happening theologically. Where are the voices going? Where, we're not seeing changes in mood here, are we? These are all indicative, right? So play with this one. And you wanted to end early tonight, so we're going to end 15 minutes early. Your homework is the Apostles' Creed. Your homework is to keep learning deductively in Lesson 11 and to keep reviewing what we've learned so far and to play with your vocabulary cards.
You said in 2 weeks, are we not meeting this week?
No, we're meeting next week. I'm giving you 2 weeks to play with the Creed because I want you to do this not just as a translation exercise, but as an exercise in applied theology. And it's going to be diagnostic. We're going to figure which ones of you are Gnostic heretics, and then we'll burn you. So it's pretty simple. So don't sweat it, It's pass-fail. Hey. Yeah, it's pass-fail. So who's going to pray us out of here tonight? Elizabeth hasn't done that in a long time. No, you haven't. Yeah, but that wasn't here.
Dear God, help us to enjoy the exploration, research, to determine your will in your ways and your words. Protect us as we travel home tonight. Protect us throughout the week. Help us to live and be an example of godly life. Amen.
Amen.
Will we be meeting during the week that is spring break for our school?
No.
It is the last week of
Between Paul's and
No, that's Holy Week. We will not meet Holy Week. That's Monday, Thursday, so we'll be busy. We're going to be stripping the altar about this time of night, and yeah. So. Oh, there are a lot of people gone from church this Holy Week because of spring break. I'm like, well, have a margarita for me, but... Thank you for the cookies, Linda.